Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. We cover a lot of different displays on this channel using different sorts of display panel technology, but what tech is the best? How does LCD compare to OLED? How does IPS LCD compare to VA LCD? How does QD-OLED compare to WOLED? I'm going to explain all of that in this freshly updated video. The last time I discussed panel tech was 3 years ago, and so much has changed since then that it's time for an update. So what are the different types of panel tech and how do they work? Well, on the monitor market right now, there are two primary display families to choose from: liquid crystal displays, aka LCDs, and organic light emitting diode displays, aka OLEDs. Each of these families has subvariants. For LCDs, the main ones in use are IPS, VA, and TN. For OLEDs, we have QD-OLED and WOLED. But first we should tackle the main differences between LCD and OLED. These are two fundamentally different approaches to creating a display, but both use a layered composition. In an LCD, the main components are a backlight, the liquid crystal layer, and various filters. The backlight uses LEDs to generate white light, which shines through the liquid crystal layer. The crystals in this layer are electrically moved to allow more or less light to pass through, depending on what color needs to be displayed. This light is then filtered into red, green, and blue components, forming subpixels. Each pixel in the display features a red, green, and blue subpixel, and that's how a pixel can display basically any color it wants. OLEDs are a simpler design. Rather than generating light and controlling its output using separate layers, an OLED generates and controls light in one step with one layer. This OLED layer has an individual organic light emitting diode for every subpixel, which can be directly controlled to generate more or less light. This light is then filtered into the usual red, green, and blue components through a separate layer. From here we get into the subvariants. For LCDs, when we talk about IPS, VA, and TN, we're talking about differences in the liquid crystal layer and how the crystals are positioned and electrically moved. TN, or twisted pneumatic displays, are the most basic design, with each crystal twisting 90 degrees to block or pass through light. IPS, or in-plane switching, has the crystals aligned parallel to the panel and they rotate to control light. VA, or vertical alignment, has the crystals aligned vertically and they tilt to control light. These subvariants are often given brand names from specific manufacturers like AHVA or PLS, but these days on product pages it's more common to just see IPS, VA, or TN listed. For OLED subvariants, the main ones for monitors are QD-OLED and WOLED. These refer to significant panel differences, including subpixel structure, light generation, and filtering. QD-OLEDs generate blue light, which is transformed into green and red for the other subpixels through a quantum dot layer. WOLEDs generate white light, which is transformed into the subpixel colors through a filter layer. WOLEDs also have a fourth white subpixel, which passes through the WOLED light in addition to the usual red, green, and blue. The physical arrangement of these subpixels is also different, with QD-OLED using a triangle design and WOLED a stripe design. How do all of these differences impact performance? Well, let's explore that, but before we do, today's video is brought to you by LG's Black Friday deals on their excellent UltraGear OLED gaming monitors. The 27GS95QE is now available for just $650 US, down 28% from its $900 MSRP, making it a fantastic way to get started with 1440p 240Hz OLED gaming. Or jump into 32-inch 4K 240Hz OLED gaming with dual mode in the 32GS95UV, now down at just $1,000, a $400 discount on its usual price. LG also has you covered if you want an OLED ultrawide, with discounts including a near 40% drop on the 34GS95QE for the white model, bringing it down to just $800 US. These are great displays at great Black Friday prices, so to grab an UltraGear OLED right now, check the links in the description below. Sale ends December 2nd for all models. When it comes to brightness, the main differences we see are between LCD and OLED families. For SDR content, LCDs are brighter when run at their maximum brightness. Across over 150 LCDs we've tested, average LCD peak brightness was 402 nits. But for OLEDs, the average was just 231 nits, so LCDs have a large brightness advantage, 74% brighter on average. When breaking down for subvariants, there isn't as much difference. Because the liquid crystal layer is separate to the backlight layer, there is no technical reason why TN, IPS, or VA LCD monitors should differ in terms of brightness. Indeed, we found an average brightness of 410 nits for IPS, 394 nits for VA, and 366 nits for TN. For QD-OLED, almost all models we've tested achieve around the same SDR brightness of 246 nits. For WOLEDs, newer models can hit 260 nits on average, while older models can't even hit 200 nits on average. There is a substantial difference in contrast ratios between each of these technologies. Generally speaking, TN panels have the worst contrast ratios. On average, we found a ratio of 982:1 for the tech, with plenty of models slotting in below 900:1. IPS is the next worst, with an average contrast of 1088:1. 29% of models tested had a ratio below 1000:1, and 21% achieved over 1200:1. Most of the time you get a little over 1000:1, which is still relatively weak, and neither IPS nor TN LCDs are known for deep blacks. VA LCDs are the best for contrast in the LCD family. The average contrast for this family across the models we've tested is 3238:1, meaning a typical VA delivers 3 times the contrast of a typical IPS. This leads to much deeper blacks on VA LCDs and a noticeably higher contrast experience. Even the worst VA panels we've seen have a higher contrast ratio than the best IPS LCDs. OLEDs have an effectively infinite contrast ratio because they can fully switch off to display black. This is not possible on most LCDs as the backlight remains on and the liquid crystal layer is attempting to block as much light as possible. OLEDs turn off a given pixel when displaying black, leading to 0 black levels. On a VA LCD calibrated to 200 nits of peak white brightness, we see on average a black level of 0.067 nits. On an IPS that increases to 0.19 nits on average, and for TN it's 0.21 nits. None of these are actually 0, and you can notice this difference in a dark room. There is no difference between QD-OLED and WOLED black levels, both deliver 0 level blacks. One of the most obvious differences between these panel technologies are their viewing angles. TN panels have the weakest viewing angles with significant shifts to colour and contrast in both the horizontal and especially vertical directions. Typical viewing angles are rated as 170/160, but realistically you'll get pretty bad shifts when viewing anywhere except for dead center. This is a big weakness for TNs and can impact the experience for productivity, where any shifts to color impact accuracy for things like photo editing. VA panels have much better viewing angles than TN panels, but don't reach the level of IPS or OLEDs in our experience. Relative to the best monitors, VAs tend to suffer from contrast or gamma shift at off-center angles, but their sweet spot for viewing is much larger than TN LCDs. Most IPS panels are better with an even wider sweet spot and less gamma, color, and brightness shift at more extreme angles, but this does vary between IPS panel manufacturers. Generally, I'd describe the IPS panels I've tested as having excellent viewing angles, a non-issue for modern IPS displays. For the best viewing angles, this is where OLED comes in. As OLEDs have a simpler panel construction, they emit cleaner light at a broader range of angles. So even relative to an IPS LCD, you'll generally get a higher quality image from an OLED at extreme angles. In most normal usage conditions, OLEDs aren't a substantial upgrade from an IPS in viewing angles, but they are better. Due to QD-OLED's top emission design, they have slightly better viewing angles than WOLED, but in my opinion, both are fantastic in this area. There are color gamut differences between the various technologies. On LCDs, color gamut is related to the backlight technology being used, so theoretically any of IPS, TN, and VA could deliver the same gamut. LCDs that use a quantum dot enhancement layer have the widest color gamut, but those that stick to more traditional backlights can still end up with upwards of 95% DCI-P3 coverage. On OLEDs, the designs of QD-OLED and WOLED lead to gamut differences. The widest color gamuts that we've seen in our testing are IPS LCDs with quantum dot layers, reaching over 80% coverage of the massive Rec 2020 gamut designed for HDR. The best examples are hitting 87% coverage. QD-OLEDs also deliver a wide gamut, achieving 81% Rec 2020 coverage on average, and we've seen some quantum dot enhanced VA LCDs also punching above 80% Rec 2020. A step down from this are the non-quantum dot enhanced LCDs. Today, most IPS and VAs offer a wide gamut, typically between 68 and 76% Rec 2020 when using standard backlights, which translates to around 95% DCI-P3 coverage and full coverage of sRGB. WOLEDs also sit in this pack, delivering on average 72% coverage of Rec 2020. This means QD-OLED has a wider color gamut out of the OLED technologies. Some TN monitors also sit in this group, especially newer designs. Then occasionally we come across monitors that do not feature a wide color gamut, but these are not restricted to a specific display technology and could be using any LCD design. I've seen examples using all of IPS, TN and VA tech, but these are less common in 2024. Most gaming monitors you'll purchase will have somewhere in the 90% plus DCI-P3 coverage range and qualify for wide gamut support. TN LCDs are the least likely to feature a wide gamut, but even in 2024 we are seeing new TNs with some form of wide gamut support. For color accuracy though, this is dictated by the monitor manufacturer and not the display technology. It's up to the manufacturer to calibrate the panel properly, and all display technologies are capable of very accurate performance when tuned appropriately. Refresh rates have steadily increased over the last few years, and we're yet to hit a ceiling on what each panel technology can achieve. Generally, this is also dictated by resolution, with lower resolutions hitting higher refresh rates. But as things stand right now, the highest refresh rate panels available are 540Hz TN LCDs at a 1080p resolution, followed closely by 500Hz IPS LCDs also at 1080p, and 480Hz WOLEDs. These WOLED panels are available either at a 1440p resolution, making them the highest refresh rate 1440p models, or at 1080p through 4K dual mode products. A step down from this, we find the highest refresh rate QD-OLEDs at 360Hz right now, and this is also where IPS LCDs top out at 1440p. The maximum that VA LCDs typically achieve is 240Hz or 250Hz at 1080p. For 4K panels, all of QD-OLED, WOLED and VA LCD offer 240Hz, but we're yet to see that from an IPS LCD, which instead typically max out at 165Hz or thereabouts. Response times are just as important for motion clarity as refresh rates. These dictate how fast the panel can transition from one color to another, with faster responses leading to less blur and ghosting. Here are the general rankings of speed. The slowest monitors we've tested are VA LCDs, excluding those tuned by Samsung. These non-Samsung VAs tend to have response time averages in the 8 to 15 millisecond range, reaching 7 millisecond for the best cases at the highest refresh rates. On average, these VAs hit 10.8 milliseconds, and in our cumulative deviation metric, which assesses how close a transition gets to the ideal instant response, the average VA sits at 844. VA LCDs also suffer from something called dark level smearing, where transitions involving dark greys are especially slow, and this leads to significant ghosting in some situations. Next up in speed are IPS LCDs, and the range of performance is quite large, with multiple generations of this technology improving performance. Across the 80 plus IPS LCDs we've tested, the average grey to grey response time is 6.9 milliseconds, but generally we see anything from 4 to 10 milliseconds. For newer panels, we tend to see a tighter range between 4 and 6.5 milliseconds. Average cumulative deviation for this panel type is 595, 42% better than VA LCDs, and most IPS LCDs that we see today sit in the 500 to 600 range, which is pretty good. Samsung tuned VAs, and I should clarify this by saying the best examples of Samsung VAs, as not all are tuned well, are a class above other VAs and sit at the top end or a little above the best IPS LCDs. Generally, we see response times in the 3 to 4 millisecond range and cumulative deviation around 400. The best IPS panels are also capable of this level of speed and cumulative deviation, but we rarely see the level of discrepancy between the best and worst examples with IPS as we do with VA. TN LCDs are the fastest form of LCD, with an average response time in our testing of 4.4 milliseconds and average cumulative deviation of 399. This is nearly 50% better than an average IPS, though of course TN LCDs have other trade-offs to achieve this speed that we've mentioned earlier. Faster response times are what enables TN LCDs to come with class-leading refresh rates. OLEDs are an order of magnitude faster than any LCD technology available today. The average response time of an OLED, whether it's WOLED or QD-OLED, which both perform the same, is just 0.3 milliseconds, and cumulative deviation sits at just 42 on average. Unique to OLEDs is that their performance doesn't change at different refresh rates. LCDs typically perform worse at lower refresh rates than they do at higher refresh rates, but with OLEDs you get the exact same speed at all times. With this response time advantage, OLEDs deliver better real-world motion clarity at a given refresh rate than LCDs. For example, an OLED running at 240Hz will deliver motion clarity much closer to a 360Hz LCD than a 240Hz LCD. Typically, OLEDs deliver motion clarity equivalent to an LCD running at 1.5 times higher refresh rate. Where LCDs can exceed the motion clarity of an OLED is through backlight strobing technology. This is a popular feature for hardcore competitive shooter players, with the best implementations today available on TN and IPS LCD panels. The quality of backlight strobing is dictated by the panel's response time speed, plus the speed and tuning of the strobe. With TN LCDs typically being faster, there is more scope to create a top-tier backlight strobing implementation. When we do compare the best strobed LCDs to the best clarity available in an OLED, there is still an advantage for strobed LCDs as they can deliver the best clarity. However, backlight strobing is a restrictive technology that doesn't work alongside adaptive sync or HDR, and it usually requires a locked, consistent frame rate for the best experience. OLEDs offer their clarity with full variable refresh and HDR compatibility. These days, there is no input lag difference between each of the panel technologies, at least when it comes to the processing delay, the time it takes for the signal to begin being displayed. However, overall input lag is still dictated by refresh rate and response times. This means in practice 480Hz OLEDs have the lowest input latency, along with fast 500Hz TN LCDs. Lastly, we need to talk about HDR characteristics. Achieving high dynamic range is inherently built into the way OLED panels work, as they have two fundamental hardware features: the ability to dim blacks all the way to zero, and individual full range control of every pixel. This results in an extremely high native contrast ratio that's already suitable for HDR, and excellent control over brightness. LCDs do not inherently have a high contrast ratio, with even the best VA LCDs topping out in the 4000 to 1 range. So to increase the contrast ratio to a suitable level for HDR, LCDs must change the backlight to something with zoned control over light output. When a zoned backlight, ideally a full array locally dimmed backlight, is run in tandem with the liquid crystal layer, the level of contrast and thus dynamic range is significantly improved. But this is a compromised experience relative to an OLED, as each zone may only control thousands of pixels, compared to the individual pixel control available with OLED. What this means is that OLEDs are better at showing bright and dark elements very close together, whereas with LCDs you may see zone-related artifacts like blooming. Generally, OLEDs are better at showing dark HDR content with high contrast due to their hardware capabilities. That's not to say an LCD can't look great in these scenes, but the hardware must work harder to achieve it. The level of contrast and control is related to the amount of backlight zones in an LCD, the more the better, but this is also related to the technology being used. VA LCDs can get away with fewer zones than an IPS LCD to display a similar image, as they have a higher native contrast ratio, at least based on what we've experienced testing these monitors. LCDs also have an HDR advantage here though, and that's brightness. LCD backlights can produce a much higher level of brightness than OLEDs can produce, especially for bright scenes that utilize the entire display area. In most real-world scenes, LCDs get significantly brighter for the brightest elements and do not vary their brightness output as much between brighter higher APL scenes and darker lower APL scenes. OLEDs are generally dimmer, and between the two OLED technologies there are differences. Our 4K QD-OLED versus 4K WOLED video goes into more detail on this, but for the latest panels, WOLEDs can get a little brighter on average, especially for brighter scenes. However, some of the earlier WOLED panels are quite a bit dimmer than a typical QD-OLED, so it depends on the monitor. WOLEDs also have worse color brightness and a narrower color gamut, which impacts the HDR presentation. At the moment, there is no clear winner for HDR performance between OLED and LCD. It really depends on the sorts of things you preference in a display. If the higher brightness of HDR is what you're looking for, then LCD will be the better choice. If you want a higher contrast and better shadows, then OLED will be the better choice. There's also the aspect of burn-in to consider. LCDs do not suffer from permanent image retention issues, aka burn-in, so they are a far better technology to use with static content, a big use case for desktop monitors. OLEDs can and will burn in over time when stressed with repeated static content, making them only really well suited to content consumption like video playback or gaming, which is much more dynamic. A few other minor points to consider are things like subpixel structure and how that relates to text quality. LCDs generally have the best text quality as they have a standard subpixel layout that operating systems like Windows harness to better render text. More unusual layouts, like we see in WOLED and QD-OLED, can lead to reduced text clarity relative to OLED at the same resolution. However, IPS, TN, and VA LCDs all have the same sort of text clarity for the most part, unless you get a rare panel with a more funky layout. Screen coatings are generally a monitor manufacturer choice and unrelated to the specific panel being used. There is no restriction that says an IPS LCD has to be matte, while a QD-OLED has to be glossy. However, what we've seen throughout the last few years are monitor makers using glossy panels for QD-OLED, as that's the primary variant Samsung Display makes, and matte finishes for most other panel types. If I had to summarize the display ecosystem today, this is what I'd say. TN panels continue to decline in popularity, and we really don't see them much anymore, outside of esports-focused gaming monitors with high refresh rates and backlight strobing. Even for budget monitors, they have been largely superseded by IPS LCDs because there are too many flaws with TN LCDs to be a general-purpose screen, particularly viewing angles and contrast. VA panels are still a mixed bag and have lost ground to IPS in many product segments, though we're starting to see a small resurgence for mini LED HDR monitors. They have some inherent strengths, like a decent native contrast ratio for an LCD, but also noticeable drawbacks like weak response time performance outside of some exclusive implementations. In the lower tiers of the market, VA performance is a big issue, and I'd have liked to see more advancements in the last few years. IPS panels are increasing in popularity, though improvements have slowed over the last few years. This panel type is typically the most balanced, with strengths in many areas including motion performance relative to other LCDs, gamut coverage, and viewing angles. These strengths tend to apply consistently in all market segments, whether high-end or entry-level, and that can make IPS a great bang-for-buck option. Due to the prevalence of flat panels with great uniformity and very wide gamuts, IPS is also the most suitable technology for gaming and content creation on the same display, though contrast ratios are still well behind what VA panels can achieve and are a weakness of this technology. Then there's OLED, which has really stepped up in the last few years to provide a strong alternative for high-end buyers. OLED is a radically different technology to the LCD variants, bringing far superior motion performance and contrast, along with inherent qualities for HDR. But there are also some downsides that prevent OLED from being a great all-round choice, such as the risk of burn-in and lower brightness than LCD counterparts. It'll be very interesting to see how OLEDs develop in the next few years and how cheap they can become. Anyway, that's it for this look at the main display technologies that we cover right here on the channel. IPS, VA, TN LCDs, and the latest QD-OLED and WOLED panels as well. So hopefully, if you are deciding upon a monitor, you want to buy a new display and you're not sure what all of these terms mean, then this video has fully described how all of these technologies play out and the sorts of performance differences that you can get between the various different panel types. If you do want to support the channel directly and the independent testing that we do here at Hardware Unboxed/Monitors Unboxed, then please do consider supporting the channel directly via our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you'll get access to some cool benefits like the ICC profiles we generate for the monitors that we review here. We've also got our Discord chat, which is a great place to talk about monitors. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.